In Lyman, night once offered infantry a few extra minutes of survival. But recently, it has taken only a small unit stepping into the wrong corridor for everything to change state within seconds, in ways that those on the ground cannot fully understand or even detect in time. Not by light, not by sound, but by an invisible signal that strips darkness of its cover and turns shadow into exposure. The problem is that measures which seem reasonable for protection at night can sometimes work against the very soldiers using them. And once the rhythm of movement is broken, the consequences extend far beyond a few seconds of confusion. So how does that first moment of detection unfold in Lyman? And why is it enough to turn an approaching group into a locked target? When darkness no longer serves as a shield, what truly determines who is allowed to move forward at night and who is pulled into pursuit from the very first meters? Join military force as we examine what is happening on this front. Night fighting near Lyman has become less about who holds the darker tree line and more about who owns the sensor picture. A Russian infantry group tried to close in on ground controlled by Ukraine's 63rd Mechanized Brigade, counting on low visibility to cover the approach. But FPV drones with thermal cameras changed the math before a shot was fired. Thermal imaging does not need streetlights or moonlight because it reads heat contrast, so bodies, weapons that were recently handled, and disturbed ground can register as signals even when the terrain looks empty. Once the group entered a corridor under observation, operators identified the moving shapes, checked spacing, and kept the camera centered while the soldiers were still committed to a direction, which is the most fragile moment for any approach. The key advantage is tempo, because the crew compresses detection, confirmation, and engagement into one continuous loop that runs faster than a squad can react in darkness. From there, the engagement shifted into a track first, strike later rhythm, because the drone could hold the target in frame, adjust its angle, and wait for the second when cover thinned or the column tightened. The danger window peaks while the unit is still moving, since a formation on the move cannot disperse instantly, cannot dig in, and often cannot change route quickly if the only exits run through open ground and narrow tree lines. When troops realize they have been found by heat rather than sound or muzzle flash, the instinct to freeze can work against them, because stillness does not erase a thermal signature. It only buys the drone time to refine its approach. Fieldcraft becomes a sensor problem, and that forces the attacking group to think in terms of line of sight and temperature, not just distance and noise. They may try to stagger spacing, move in short bursts, and use colder ground or waterlogged patches to reduce contrast, yet each adjustment slows the assault and lengthens exposure time. Wet clothing can cool faster than dry fabric, walls and berms can block the camera's view, and shallow ditches can cut the silhouette. But none of these tricks are guaranteed if the drone keeps circling and updating the picture in real time. Even weather is unreliable cover, because wind and drifting clouds can change background temperature. Yet the human body remains a steady heat source that reappears once the angle opens. In this kind of night raid, the question is no longer whether the approach will be seen, but how the Russian group will try to reduce its heat profile, and whether that effort holds long enough to break contact before the strike cycle closes. Some Russian soldiers have tried a simple fix for a modern problem, which is to wrap themselves in blankets or insulated layers to dull the heat signature while advancing at night. The idea is not new, because armies have always looked for ways to hide movement in darkness, and thermal cameras have made that effort urgent. In theory, if the sensor cannot see a bright human outline, the approach might survive long enough to reach cover, take positions, and force a close-range fight where drones have less room to maneuver. Yet the front around Lyman shows a harder reality, since the contest is no longer only between eyes and shadows, but between heat, contrast, and software trained to spot patterns. On a drone-watched front, that logic breaks quickly, because the human body does not radiate heat evenly, and the parts that must stay exposed are often the parts that matter most. Heads, hands, and lower legs still emit infrared energy, so even a few uncovered hotspots can give a thermal sensor enough contrast to outline the target and keep it centered as it moves. A squad might look dim instead of glowing, but it is still trackable when the drone has time to hover, confirm movement, and follow the same heat points from frame to frame. Even breathing can matter in cold air, since a face that is briefly uncovered to see, communicate, or drink can produce a signal that anchors the track. Once the operator has that anchor, the drone can maintain contact through partial cover and short pauses, because the goal is not a perfect image, but a consistent cue. There is a second trap, because camouflage can reveal soldiers in reverse, and the attempt to look colder can create a different kind of contrast. If the covering cools slower or faster than the surrounding ground, it can create a boundary that reads as an unnatural shape, so a person is detected as a cutout against the background rather than a flare in the foreground. Thermal cameras are built to pick up edges and temperature gradients, and a moving edge is often more useful than a bright spot. This is why improvised insulation can backfire when it forms a smooth block that does not match the textures of grass, snow, branches, and rubble. A soldier becomes a moving anomaly, and motion is the strongest clue of all, since trees and walls do not drift forward in small steps and then stop on command. In that sense, the camouflage does not hide the unit, it labels it. Once the target is labeled, night loses its oldest advantage because FPV drones do not need visible light to track motion and predict where a group will go next along paths, ditches, and tree lines. The engagement stops being about whether the unit can cross unseen and becomes about how long it is tracked before the strike comes. That time matters because tracking is not passive, and a drone that holds a target can adjust its angle, tighten the approach, and wait for the second when the group is most compressed and least able to scatter. If the soldiers hesitate at an open crossing, they bunch near the only cover, and that crowding creates a cleaner aim point. If they rush, they follow the same corridor faster, and speed can still be predictable when exits are limited by mines, wire, and terrain. FPV teams also work inside a network, so one drone can keep contact while another launches, or while other fires are prepared on the escape route. This is the bridge to the next phase, because once a target has been locked long enough, the deciding factor is timing, and the FPV drives in precisely when the formation is moving, still fully committed, and not yet able to break the tracking pattern. The first FPV strikes begin while the infantry group is still in motion, and that timing is decisive because movement reduces awareness and limits reaction options. A unit that is advancing focuses forward, checks footing, and maintains spacing, so it is less prepared to scan the sky or detect the direction of a fast-approaching drone. When the attack comes during this phase, soldiers often struggle to identify where the drone is entering from, which delays any attempt to scatter or seek cover. The assault unfolds in short, controlled bursts rather than a single dramatic blast, because operators shape the strike around terrain and timing. They wait for the moment when the formation crosses an open patch, steps onto a straight stretch between trees, or funnels through a narrow path where deviation is difficult. These predictable segments reduce uncertainty for the pilot and increase exposure for the group on the ground, especially when visibility remains low and orientation is already strained by darkness. The first impact usually has an effect beyond its immediate damage, because it disrupts the rhythm of the advance. Once a leading element is hit or forced to drop, spacing collapses and communication becomes strained under stress. What began as a coordinated push quickly turns into a series of individual reactions, with soldiers diving into shallow depressions or pressing against structures that offer only partial cover. That fragmentation is not accidental, since breaking cohesion is often more important than the initial blast itself. A dispersed group cannot maintain its planned tempo, cannot maneuver with confidence, and cannot easily extract wounded members without exposing others. The battlefield picture changes within seconds, and momentum shifts from forward pressure to defensive scrambling that drains both time and morale. Night imagery recorded after similar engagements shows multiple impact points across confined areas, which suggests a chain of strikes rather than a single encounter. Scattered debris, heat traces, and disturbed ground indicate that once the first drone commits, follow-up drones or repeat passes exploit the disorder. This layered pressure magnifies psychological strain because soldiers must divide attention between immediate survival and the expectation of another approach from a new angle. Under those conditions, situational awareness narrows and coordination weakens. Each individual begins to think in terms of personal cover instead of collective movement, and that shift erodes the structure required to continue an organized assault. Even short pauses to regroup can become visible signals, since clustered heat signatures stand out against cooler surroundings and confirm to operators that the unit remains fixed in place. The result is a steady erosion of initiative, where every attempt to recover balance risks drawing renewed attention. As the group breaks into smaller clusters, self-protection becomes more difficult rather than easier. Every soldier must track possible incoming fire, read the terrain, and remain alert to overhead surveillance at the same time, which overloads decision-making under pressure. Without tight coordination, the ability to suppress the drone, reposition efficiently, or withdraw in an orderly manner declines sharply. Simple actions such as dragging a casualty to cover or shifting position along a ditch can create new movement patterns that attract fresh engagement. The engagement then shifts from offensive intent to basic survival, and the original objective fades behind the need to reduce further losses. This pattern has appeared repeatedly in night clashes around Lyman, and it reflects structural conditions rather than isolated mistakes. Minefields, damaged roads, scattered obstacles, and persistent UAV coverage compress attacking forces into limited corridors, so each advance becomes a narrow calculation with few exits and little margin for error in a landscape already shaped by previous fighting. In the Lyman sector, infantry assaults face structural limits long before they reach direct contact, because minefields, physical obstacles, and dense UAV activity expose movement at distance. The battlefield is shaped not only by trenches and tree lines, but by layered denial measures that slow any advance and make concealment fragile from the first step. Mine belts, anti-personnel devices, and scattered barriers restrict maneuver options, turning what appears on a map as open ground into a sequence of narrow approach lanes. Damaged roads, shell craters, and debris further guide troops toward the few passable routes, which quickly become familiar after repeated engagements and are steadily refined through observation. Once movement is compressed into these corridors, initiative narrows as well, since units must choose between delay and exposure under constant observation. A slower approach increases time spent inside monitored zones, while a faster push risks entering mined or obstructed segments without sufficient spacing or preparation. This tension defines the opening phase of most assaults in the area and shapes decisions at every level of command. UAV reconnaissance intensifies this constraint by holding suspected corridors in near-continuous observation. Surveillance platforms scan for patterns of movement rather than waiting for gunfire, and direction of travel often reveals intent before contact occurs. When a formation enters a known channel, it is assessed by spacing, rhythm, and commitment to a path, which can be read even in limited visibility. The reconnaissance drone does not need to strike, because its role is to maintain a stable picture and confirm sustained advance over time. FPV operators then wait for a decisive segment, usually where lateral escape is restricted by mines, damaged ground, or natural barriers. The strike is shaped by geometry rather than surprise alone. If terrain and obstacles prevent abrupt turns, the advancing group becomes a constrained target whose projected path can be calculated seconds in advance. Repeated attempts to press forward often produce similar outcomes, since the same corridors remain under watch and the same limitations apply to each new push. Over time, this transforms Lyman into an attrition zone where the approach itself becomes the primary battleground rather than a brief prelude to close combat. Efforts to generate momentum face a structural contradiction in this environment. To build force, units must gather and move with coordination, yet concentration increases visibility under aerial surveillance. Organizing an assault creates clearer movement signatures, especially when terrain channels troops into the same few lines already mapped by drones and monitored through repeated sorties. Each regrouping effort risks exposure, and each renewed attempt to cross established corridors risks interruption before reaching defensive positions. This cycle gradually erodes operational flexibility and compels commanders to weigh limited territorial gains against steady losses in manpower and time. As maneuver corridors become effectively locked, vulnerability extends beyond the assaulting formation. A deeper weakness emerges in the support structure that sustains it. Ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcement teams must often travel along similar restricted routes, placing logistics inside the same predictable geometry of observation. When supply movements are compressed into narrow lanes under constant UAV coverage, the strain spreads from the frontline units to the entire operational chain. The pressure therefore shifts from a single clash at the edge of contact to a broader contest over how resources are pushed forward in a landscape where movement itself has become the central risk and delay carries its own operational cost. Footage from the Lyman area shows soldiers carrying ammunition on their backs as they move toward forward positions, and that image reflects more than individual burden. It signals a logistical strain shaped by dense aerial surveillance and limited safe routes across contested ground. In sectors where UAV coverage is constant, vehicle-based resupply becomes increasingly exposed and difficult to conceal. Trucks and light armored carriers create larger thermal and visual signatures, and their movement along predictable roads can be detected from a distance. Even short runs risk drawing attention if repeated along the same corridor. As a result, the flow of ammunition is often broken into smaller loads carried by individuals or compact teams, each attempting to reduce visibility by blending into terrain and moving in staggered intervals. This shift from centralized delivery to dispersed transport marks a deeper change in how frontline support is organized. Fragmented supply alters the rhythm of combat in measurable ways. When ammunition arrives in scattered quantities rather than steady convoys, frontline units cannot sustain continuous fire at a consistent pace. Preparation for each assault takes longer, because commanders must wait until enough rounds are gathered to support coordinated movement. Even defensive actions are affected, since limited stock at a position forces careful rationing and shorter bursts of engagement. The tempo of battle begins to fluctuate with delivery patterns, rather than tactical ambition alone. Repeated foot-based deliveries also multiply exposure. Each movement toward the front becomes another potential point of detection under thermal and visual observation. A pattern of individuals moving in similar directions over time can reveal the outline of a supply route, even if each trip appears minor in isolation. This creates a difficult balance. Reducing movement preserves concealment but risks shortage, while increasing movement sustains supply but expands the window for tracking. This tension links drone presence directly to logistical stability. Unmanned systems do not need to eliminate every carrier to weaken an offensive effort. By forcing resupply into smaller and slower segments, they interrupt the steady flow that coordinated operations require. A unit that cannot rely on predictable ammunition support struggles to synchronize fire, maintain suppressive pressure, or respond quickly to unexpected resistance. Over time, incremental delays accumulate into broader operational strain. Small gaps in delivery translate into postponed assaults and cautious maneuver, as commanders account for uncertain stock levels before committing forces. The burden on individual soldiers increases as well, because carrying additional weight across damaged terrain reduces speed and endurance. Fatigue compounds risk, especially when movement itself may attract renewed surveillance. When shortages coincide with persistent tracking, assaults can slip toward disorder. Groups advancing with limited supply face a narrower margin for correction if contact intensifies or withdrawal becomes necessary. Pressure on the front line then extends beyond direct engagement and into the question of whether resources can reach positions in time to preserve cohesion. In this environment, logistics and aerial observation merge into a single constraint that shapes initiative, limits momentum, and defines how long any push can be sustained under watch. In one recorded incident, a soldier advanced while carrying a grenade, was stopped by defensive fire, and the explosive detonated as he attempted to retreat amid confusion. The episode illustrates more than individual misfortune. It signals a breakdown in tempo, where a coordinated assault shifts into isolated reactions under pressure. When a formation loses its rhythm, each member begins to act on instinct rather than synchronized command. In an environment under persistent UAV observation, that shift carries immediate risk. Every sudden turn, every brief regrouping, and every unexpected pause increases the chance of being reacquired by aerial sensors. The battlefield becomes sensitive to motion patterns as much as to direct fire. A soldier who pivots abruptly or retraces his steps can generate a clear visual cue from above. In such conditions, confusion is not neutral, because it produces signals that feed the tracking process. Once panic appears in one part of the formation, it tends to ripple outward through hesitation and uncertainty, slowing collective response and distorting previously planned movement. The original axis of advance can blur within seconds. Teammates may slow down to assess what happened, change direction to avoid perceived threats, or cluster briefly to communicate. Each of these reactions alters spacing and creates movement signatures that stand out against the terrain. What begins as a defensive reflex can therefore widen exposure instead of reducing it. The defending side benefits from this dynamic, since control of the sensor picture allows it to shape tempo without constant direct contact. By observing the unfolding disorder, defenders can time further responses when attackers are least organized and most compressed by uncertainty. As fragmentation increases, the attacking force loses the ability to sustain coordinated pressure. Structured maneuvers give way to scattered actions, and individual survival decisions replace collective timing. This transition favors the side that maintains continuous observation and anticipates likely movement paths. Attempts to restore cohesion often require halting or regrouping, which produces additional exposure under aerial watch. The cycle reinforces itself and converts temporary confusion into sustained vulnerability that compounds with each failed adjustment. From this perspective, the incident is not an isolated accident, but part of a recurring pattern. Night operations in this sector are shaped by continuous tracking and rapid exploitation of disorder, where sensor-driven control defines the rhythm of engagement and turns fragmented reactions into predictable outcomes over repeated clashes. Drone teams from Ukraine's 63rd Brigade continue to track and strike small groups operating at night, limiting the ability of Russian forces to consolidate or expand newly seized ground. The sequence observed around Lyman reflects a compact night hunting model that begins with thermal detection, shifts to engagement during movement, and then pulls the opponent into a cycle of attrition. FPV drones equipped with thermal cameras have become decisive in nocturnal operations because they turn darkness into a monitored space and convert dispersed formations into traceable targets. If this rhythm persists, the attacking side will be forced to adjust thermal discipline, movement planning, and assault timing, while the defending side can refine sensor-based interception at earlier stages of assembly. The unresolved question is strategic rather than tactical. When darkness can be penetrated by heat, surprise becomes harder to manufacture, and any attempt to mass force risks exposure before contact even begins. If you want clear, grounded battlefield analysis without exaggeration or noise, subscribe to Military Force. Each episode breaks down tactics, technology, and strategy in a way that helps viewers understand not just how wars are fought, but what they mean for global stability and long-term peace. Stay informed, stay critical, and follow Military Force for serious analysis that connects the battlefield to the bigger picture.